Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 203. This week the questions are taken from guide 249, that is the guide to the Merrimack class frigates of the United States Navy, and the Wednesday video, the Regia Marina in World War II, the underappreciated Navy, which I believe was the first appearance of the much appreciated and wonderful Vince O'Hara on the channel. Brandon Judge asks, let's say you've picked up a submarine contact on sonar in World War II. How would you make sure that the submarine is one of the bad guys and not one of your own friendly subs? The short answer is you can't. There's no underwater IFF, there's no way of communicating with that sub, and of course if you're wrong, things could go very badly for you. So you basically have one of two options, and it's entirely up to your own judgment and your knowledge, but you can either let it go or you can blow it up. The decision making will be based on where you are geographically. So if you are in, say, the middle of the Atlantic and you are an Allied anti-submarine warfare vessel and you happen to detect a submarine on sonar near your convoy, sorry, but it's going to get depth charged because the Allied submarines were told don't go there. They're basically zones of operation where Allied submarines could operate on the surface, and there were zones of operation where they might be operating under the surface, and if the sub was outside of those areas, then it was taking its life into its own hands. Because, as I said, there's no actual way of identifying these things when things are underwater. So, if you were in an area in one of the zones where you knew that Allied subs may be operating, then obviously, if the sub's on the surface, it's easy to challenge it. But if it's on sonar and you can't, then it's down to the captain's initiative. Now, if you're in a shipping lane, let's say near a Royal Navy sub base, and you've been told around about this time there will be this afternoon there will be a Allied submarine transiting the area, then obviously you'd hold off, but you'd probably also try and keep it on sonar as a contact for a little bit just to see how it acts, just in case it might also be a U-boat. So if you're pinging away with sonar and you're 20 miles off a Royal Navy submarine base, the odds of it being if you're on the sub, obviously, then the odds of that pinging being a German anti-submarine vessel are very, very low. So you know it's an Allied vessel, and you would just continue straight and level and hope they got the message. And if you're an Allied ship and you're pinging away on sonar and you see the submarine just merrily proceeding along as if nothing really is going badly in the world, then you'd be like, okay, well, this is friendly, so we'll leave it alone. Whereas obviously if you ping a sub off the UK coast and it starts trying to evade and twist and turn, that's much more suspicious behaviour, and you probably try and depth charge it anyway. Now, did this lead to friendly fire? Yes, unfortunately. On both sides, there were instances of friendly anti-submarine hunting vessels attacking, or aircraft as well, attacking friendly subs. But for the most part, by keeping to their specific areas of operation, this was avoided more often than it happened. Joshua Sutherland asks, how would you rate the Parrott and Brooke rifles used during the Civil War against their European contemporaries? So it's a very complex question, and something that, again, probably lends itself to a Wednesday video at some point in the future, a comparison of various forms of naval artillery at the start of the Ironclad Age, the early 1860s, not least because there is the monstrous treatise on ordnance, which I've referenced a few times before, which covers all of those results. So a comparative analysis might be possible, even if it takes a while, but summarizing the results of those various analyses at the time in their performance against, obviously, in real life targets in the American Civil War, as well as targets that set up for testing ranges, the general opinion of European observers from those tests seems to have been relatively positive for the Brooke rifles. There's not an awful lot that's said negatively about them. They seem to be considered on a par with European weapons of roughly the same caliber, which is, a fairly good mark. The Parrots, on the other hand, are a little bit more divisive. On the one hand, the Parrott rifles or the Parrott guns seemed to outperform the Dahlgrens of similar caliber very slightly. So whereas an 11-inch Dahlgren firing standard 1862 pattern service charges was not able to breach the 4.5-inch thick armour of HMS Warrior in target form, the 11-inch Parrott rifle, it's noted, was able to crack and penetrate ordinary quality cast iron armour of Warrior grade thickness, but the best armour, the best iron plate used for Warrior's armour, which obviously then is replicated in target form, the Parrott rifle was able to significantly impact and dent but not penetrate. So it's slightly more capable than an equivalent Dahlgren. And generally the theme that tends to come through on the various analyses and tests and evaluations of the Parrotts is that they're quite powerful for their time, but on the other hand, they also seem to suffer significant problems with the guns cracking, muzzles being blown off, etc. So they don't have a lot of durability, which is considered to be a fairly major problem because, of course, in battle, your gun blowing up on you is not necessarily a good thing, and that seems to be correlated with the US reports that Parrott rifles did have an unusually high prevalence of a bursting on people. So it seems that they were overcharged in order to get that slightly increased performance, and so they're viewed as some of the most powerful American artillery out there. Depending on the caliber, because obviously you have anything from 20-pounder all the way up to 300-pounder naval Parrott guns. But depending on the particular weapon in question, they seem to be upper end in terms of penetration capabilities. They're up there with the top 5 of comparative weapons, but they don't have the endurance to be viewed as reliable. In fact, one period evaluation, which is quoted directly in the treatise, it seems to cover most American guns in general, but it is also written specifically after tests of some Parrott rifles, particularly the Parrott 100-pounder. And it says that the Americans appear to have a natural predilection for what is big, and they have applied themselves to the production of huge guns made on every variety of pattern with very little scientific uniformity and direction. If we are correctly informed, none of these guns have shown that durability which is essential to permanent service, nor have their effects corresponded to the cost and labour bestowed on them. They do, however, seem to like the Parrott gun's accuracy and rifling system. A lot of the comments basically seeming to be along the lines of, they're actually relatively nice guns. It would just be nice if they could stop them blowing up every so often. Peter Hoag asks, until now I've never realised that Merrimac engaged one of her sisters at the Battle of Hampton Roads. Are there any other instances of sister ships ending up on opposite sides in a battle? That incident, of course, being when USS Minnesota exchanged shots with the by then CSS Virginia at the Battle of Hampton Roads. Now, as for other instances of sister ships squaring off against each other, there have been a surprising number of these occurrences, but much fewer where they've actually come to blows. Obviously, civil wars tend to be the easiest opportunity for these kinds of things to happen. The Spanish Civil War, for example, saw 2 of the España-class dreadnoughts facing off against each other, although they didn't actually engage. In more modern times, of course, in the Falklands War, the Argentinians deployed Type 42 destroyers, and so did the British, so they were both facing off against each other, although then again, they didn't directly engage. In the Age of Sail, it was actually relatively common for sister ships to end up fighting each other once wars had gotten on for quite a while because of the eternally shifting nature of the makeup of each side's fleets, with people capturing ships from both sides. Now, when you got up to capital ship levels, i.e. first through third rates, it was more common for French and Spanish ships to find themselves facing off against their sister ships for the obvious reason that the Royal Navy captured a lot more ships of the line from the enemy than the enemy captured from them. But when you got down to frigates and unrated ships, brigs and sloops, etc., there was a semi-regular pattern of ships that were of the same class actually ending up on opposite sides and then meeting up and fighting against each other. For example, at the Battle of Trafalgar, the HMS Tonnant was the lead ship of the Tonnant class, and HMS Belle-Isle was a Temeraire class 74-gun ship of the line, and both of those vessels, obviously in the Royal Navy, ended up facing off against various other Temeraire and Tonnant class ships of the line at the Battle of Trafalgar. For example, Fougeot was a Temeraire class ship of the line, and Indomptable was a Tonnant class ship of the line, and they were on the opposite side. XH1927 asks, I'd like to know more about the specifics of scrapping. It's somewhat easy to understand with metal ships, as metal scrapping is a process I know quite well, but I'm wondering how wooden ship scrapping worked. I wouldn't think a bunch of tar and saltwater soaked timbers would be very useful or valuable. Of course, fittings can be recycled and reused, but those would seem to be only a tiny fraction of the tonnage one would be investing in when buying a decommissioned vessel to scrap. You'd actually be surprised by how much of a wooden ship can be reused, at least at the time of when wooden ships were still being built. Later on, when wooden ships were being broken up and you had the ironclad age advancing, there was still some useful salvage to be had from them for composite vessels and so on and so forth, but less so than before. In the latter part of the 19th century, a lot of the stuff would go to furniture makers, or it would go to buildings, because you're talking about very large timbers, so there might be quite a lot of them in a ship, but a single large timber, like you can see here, might make a very good beam for a large room in a house or a pub. And so there are quite a few pubs and other public buildings in the UK, not a few manor houses, which can trace the presence of either single beams or perhaps entire structures to sections of ship that were bought and repurposed, because the stuff that's tar and saltwater soaked tends to be the outer planking, and that was kind of a semi-disposable item anyway, so that could be gotten rid of as just scrap firewood, whatever, make a very small return on investment on that. But quite often the inner planking could be sold to be reused on other ships, and a lot of the internal beam structure as well could be sold to be reused, because, okay, the single large frames, not so much, because that's cut and shaped very specifically to a certain type of ship, but when you had segmented frame sections or deck beams, even sections of the keel or the stern post, etc., a lot of these were, in the classic age of sail, single large timbers that had either been grown to that shape or had been picked because they had grown to that shape, and they weren't exactly easy to get hold of, especially in seasoned form. So if you could get one at a discount, somewhat used, as long as it was in decent shape, that was much better than having to go out and find one, cut it down, season it, etc., wait for it to be ready. So when you were breaking up a wooden ship of the line, you kind of had these three major outlets. You had the fourth, which was the minor, scrap stuff for firewood, etc. You had repurposing of major elements for new vessels. You had selling on of major timbers for the construction industry, and then finally for things like deck planking and some parts of the inner planking, etc. You had selling it on to furniture makers and so forth, and that was something of a major industry, because there's a lot of surviving furniture from the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries that are all built from timbers of X or Y ship, because again, they're seasoned, they're durable, they're proven, what's not to like. And even in the first part of the 20th century, when the deck timbers were being taken off of ships, quite often they would be repurposed into furniture as well, which is where a lot of the wood from various ships that were in active service in World War I and World War II that still survives actually comes from, when that furniture finally breaks down and people realise what they've got and break up that wood for souvenirs. Anton Hengst asks, Why do warship superstructures exist? Is everything that is in a superstructure something that must be in a superstructure to function? And if so, why did such things that can't be below deck to work proliferate so quickly? So, warship superstructures have an interesting development cycle. Of course, back in the Age of Sail, you had the aft section of the ship, formerly known as the stern castle, and the forecastle as well, which were built up, I guess, superstructures initially to defend against boarding actions, and then latterly as officers' quarters, for the most part in the stern, at least. Then you had the coming of, well, the latter part of the Age of Sail, and then the Age of Iron, and for the most part superstructures disappeared for a while. But then if you saw the video on HMS Warrior, you had the beginnings of what would become a superstructure with the armoured spotting-fighting compartment that would later become a conning tower, and the literal bridge that would later become the more colloquial bridge, as in a command and control station. But there wasn't that much at first. But then the need for a better place to see from to navigate and command the ship came about, so the bridge in the command sense started to come around, and obviously that was moved forward. As masts disappeared in terms of sail power, then spotting was still needed, so some form of mast was still there. And then you had, obviously, as you've introduced machinery to things, you've got very complicated guns and so on and so forth. And so as ships' freeboard decreases, because they want to minimise the area of hull that needs to be protected by armour, whereas the old ships obviously were very high freeboard, then you start to run out of places to put them in, because previously you could accommodate lots of people on the gun decks, but now the gun decks, such as they existed perhaps in casement battery decks, were not full width. You had funnels in the way, you had ammunition passages in the way, you had barbettes in the way, and so on and so forth. And with relatively limited volume in the interior of the ship, you needed basically somewhere to store the crew, amongst other things. And that meant up above, because crew are, relatively speaking, lightweight compared to some other things that you'd have on a warship. And so when you look at things like HMS Devastation and Thunderer and that era's Dreadnought, etc., you start to see initially these superstructures are being built up mostly as accommodation, messes, etc. But then as time goes on, you need further things that are mounted high. So spotlights, searchlights, additional lookout stations, much later on obviously radar, earlier than that fire control mechanisms, anti-aircraft weaponry, going back a little bit further still, some of the secondary battery, because, you know, low-mounted casements don't really work that well in any kind of significant sea state. And then as time goes on, you've sort of obviously got... so all of this is needing to be above the hull, and so the superstructure gets larger. And then when the superstructure is larger, well, you've also got to introduce radio equipment. That doesn't work too well inside the hull. You've also, officers are taking the opportunity to go, well, if we've got all this superstructure space, we might as well have some nicer quarters than what can be fitted in between all the other functioning bits of the ship down in the hull. And, you know, things build up and up and up and up like this. So as all those things proliferate, the superstructures themselves get larger. And then, of course, as some of that equipment like fire control directors and radar and such gets heavier, then the superstructure itself needs to be larger and stronger to support it, and so the superstructure grows even more. And that's before you get into, you know, scout planes and hangars and storage for all of that kind of stuff. UNSC Forward On to Dawn asks, I've had a look recently at the British-built Argentinian light cruiser La Argentina. It looks, for its size, a fairly powerful little ship with 9 6-inch guns, 6 torpedo tubes, 3-inch belt armour, 30-knot top speed, 12,000 nautical mile range, etc., on a hull that only weighed 6,500 tons standard displacement. Did the Royal Navy ever consider producing their own versions of La Argentina? Well, the La Argentina is a pretty nice ship, and you can make a reasonable argument that perhaps this is what the Royal Navy should have gone with from the start. Instead of building the Leanders and the Arethusas, you build this thing which sits in between the two displacement-wise, but actually carries more guns than the Leanders and a lot more guns than the Arethusas. But at the same time, in the early 1920s, the Royal Navy still was not particularly enamoured of the triple turret. They only really went with the twin 6 on the Leanders because they managed to get one of them working on Enterprise, but that's a separate story. So, whilst yes, La Argentina was probably a very, very good template for, a small 6-inch light cruiser, the problem is that by the time she is built in the late 1930s, things have moved on. Because remember, the Leanders and the Arethusas were built by the Royal Navy largely because they were trying to get as many cruisers as they could out of the displacement that they had left in the naval treaties. By the late 1930s, they were building the Didos for AA work, and of course the 6-inch gun isn't really a dual-purpose weapon. And, well, the Didos aren't just AA cruisers, they're all sorts, but they have dual-purpose weapons, which the 6-inches aren't, is the main point there. And they're also building the Towns, which are, of course, ostensibly at least 10,000-ton light cruisers, one, to fill up their cruiser displacement, and two, because they realise they need full-size treaty-compliant cruisers because everyone else is building them. And then later on they move on to the Fijis, and the Fijis, or Crown Colonies, depending, either one is in use at the time. Some people try and tell you that it's, that the Crown Colony is incorrect. No, it's not. There are period sources talking about it, but talking about them as the Crown Colonies, but never mind. Anyway, the broader point is that the Crown Colonies are, okay, they're a couple of thousand tons heavier, but that's initially because they have the same 12 guns as the Towns, and even once you get to the Ceylon subclass, which have 9 6-inch guns, which is the same as La Argentina, you're well into the mid-war, and 2, obviously they're slightly larger, carrying some more AA, slightly more armour, and of course they're having to carry the radar and all the other new sensors as well, which is why they drop one of the triple turrets. So at the time that Argentina is being built, it's no longer a viable vessel for the Royal Navy to build, because it's not going to have enough expansion room to provide them with, the carriage of radar and enhanced AA that they need. But if La Argentina had been built in, say, 1930, then there would definitely be a very strong case for the Royal Navy producing their own versions thereof. Arctic Temper asks, I've heard U-boat stories that involve them sitting anchored on the surface at night, seemingly doing nothing. Why would a U-boat be doing this? Well, earlier on in the war, at least before, searchlight and radar-equipped aircraft came into play, and even once they did, at least in the mid-Atlantic for a little bit further beyond, it was a fairly safe thing for a U-boat to do, because if they're going to stay out on station for as long as possible, they need to conserve fuel. And if they're running underwater, they're going to be using their battery. If they're running on the surface, they're going to be using the diesel. If they're anchored or just motoring along very slowly on the surface, using a sea anchor, obviously you're not going to anchor in 3-mile depth of the Atlantic, then you're relatively stationary, relatively safe, and conserving a massive amount of fuel. And again, in the early part of the war, you're not going to accomplish all that much by sailing back and forth at night either. The convoys are sailing darkened, so you're not very unlikely to spot them by light signals and so forth. And if you are going to happen to stumble across a convoy, well, the statistical odds of one of them stumbling across you while you're on the surface are about even to you finding them by meandering around blindly in the dark. And if you meander around blindly in the dark, there is a slightly higher chance of you being spotted, because you'll have a wake and a bow waving and so forth, and someone on a corvette or destroyer or some other escort who's got a higher vantage point than you do might spot you coming before you spot them, and then you end up being sunk. So it's a bit safer to just sit there, conserve fuel because you can't see anything anyway, and wait for daylight and then go off on your own merry way, whether that be hunting or avoiding convoys and their escorts. Of course, as time goes on, then that changes. Sitting on the surface becomes much more dangerous once widespread surface search radar and air-to-surface radar comes into effect, and they have to adapt. But for a good chunk of the early to mid part of the war, it was the best way to extend their stay on station relatively effectively. Tim Claridge asks, did any other armed forces in the World War II era, other than the US, try to develop skip bombing techniques and low-level anti-shipping capable aircraft festooned with outrageous numbers of anti-aircraft fire-suppressing guns? It seems like a very good, albeit challenging, strategy for air power to influence sea lines of communication. The answer is yes. There was a thing called Highball, which the British developed, which was an adaptation of the bouncing bomb. You can see it being tested here up in Scotland on the old battleship HMS Malaya. And, they're best described, as you can see there, as golf balls of doom, specifically designed to skip across the water and deliver a large amount of explosive to the side of a target ship at fairly high speed. I mean, that Mosquito is really booking it, and this is significantly slowed down film. But, they were pretty lethal. They tested them on Malaya, they tested them on the battleship Lorraine, they tested them in a number of other places as well. And, these are inert rounds, so they're empty cases just designed to test whether or not the whole effect actually works properly, because these are spherical as opposed to the bouncing bombs they used on the dams in Germany, which were cylindrical. But yeah, they work pretty well. I mean, you can see they're pretty accurate. But also, despite the fact that these are inert, you can see there that poor old Malaya is listing a little bit. Here's some close-ups of what happens when the inert casings just hit the ship. But, if you see some of the other footage from the tests done on Lorraine, as well as some of the other footage from some of the runs done on Malaya, the reason good old Malaya there is listing is because one or two of them, despite being inert empty casings, still punched through her side. And the footage of Lorraine is equally as disturbing for those of you who like ships, although I'm sure Chris from Military Aviation History would absolutely love the footage, because, these things are not small bombs. I mean, you can see you've got people and the size of the scuttles there, so these are pretty hefty weapons. There's a hole. When you just see the side of a battleship deform and such a large sphere of what could be explosive just wander inside, not a good feeling for a naval historian. Ben Clayton asks, I've always wondered if staying with coal firing, at least for heavy cruisers and upwards, might not have been an option for Italy. If they stayed inside the Mediterranean, range wouldn't have been an issue, and there's a lot more coal in Greater Europe than oil. World War II might have been more complex with the Italian fleet actually able to move. So, technically, yes, Italy would have been more self-sustaining when it came to its battleships and heavy cruisers if they had been coal-powered, because they would have had coal available. On the other hand, you have the rather larger problem of getting the ships to function in that way, because shoveling coal is not a fun activity, coaling a ship is not a fun activity, and the work that was needed for, say, something like the battle cruisers in World War I, where they're travelling in the higher 20s of knots, that was hell, even if you can get your hands on good coal. And bear in mind, obviously, the difference between good coal and bad coal. With oil, Italy might not have a lot of it, but when they send their ships out, they can guarantee that when they need the power on tap, they can open up the sprayers, and the ship will keep going at that speed for as long as is needed, unless and until they run out of fuel. If you rely on poor quality coal, then in the course of the multi-day high-speed operations the Italian Navy actually carries out, you would end up having to slow down at least once, possibly twice, to clean out the boilers, which would render you horrifically vulnerable, because at that point you have no choice. You're either going to be slowed temporarily to clean the boilers out, and when we say temporarily we mean several hours, or you're going to try and force things if an enemy fleet shows up, and you still won't get up to very high speeds, and then your boiler will pack up entirely. So not really a good option. And of course, if you're shoveling enough coal to keep Italian battleships and cruisers going at their top speeds, I genuinely would never, ever, ever, ever want that job. It was bad enough for the small coal-fired destroyers that could hit 30 plus knots, let alone, shoveling enough fuel to keep a Littorio going at 30 knots for a prolonged period of time. The logistics of it would have been only simpler in terms of supplying the fuel. In terms of the actual operations, it would have made everything far more difficult, far more complex, and far less popular with the crews. So, yeah, that's basically kind of why they didn't go for it. Now, I suppose in theory you could make an argument for maybe having coal-fired cruising turbines and oil-fired high-speed turbines, but that only reduces the amount of issues. It doesn't eliminate them. And, there's also energy density to take into account. The amount of machinery that you'd need for coal-firing machinery to get up to the kind of speeds the Italians wanted would be a very different beast to just running it with oil. So, yeah, it's one of those things where technically speaking, yes, they could have, but there's an awful lot of practical reasons why they didn't. Olifax asks, when HMS Audacious sank, was it a problem with design, damage control, or the mine just defeated both no matter what they tried? Now, obviously, Audacious as a early 1910s design didn't have anything like the level of underwater protection that you'd see in later ships, indeed even in ships built 3 or 4 years later. But reading the damage control reports and the aftermath inquiry into the loss of Audacious, there are a certain number of eerie parallels with, in some ways, with the loss of a number of ships at Pearl Harbor. So you have partially the fact that the ship wasn't at action stations, it wasn't as locked up tightly as it could have been, and indeed you could argue should have been, given that it was sailing in wartime conditions. Obviously at Pearl Harbor there is a little bit more of an excuse for people because, they were peacefully in port and then they were under attack. Realistically speaking, Audacious should have been fully locked up while she was sailing in wartime conditions. She wasn't, because they thought they were in a safe area with no impending enemy operations, but as this and a couple of other lessons taught rather dramatically, there is nowhere that you can say you're safe from enemy mines, as was actually the case with Audacious, or U-boats, as was the case with a number of other vessels. So that was one failing. The other failing, which is obviously once they hit the mine, they tried to lock things up, but mine damage tends to distort frames and such, so not everything could lock up properly. But the other thing, which is where more of the parallels with Pearl Harbor come in, is that bulkheads failed due to a series of poorly maintained seals, unauthorized piercings of the bulkhead, and other failings of areas where pipes and cabling had been put through, and they weren't watertight, or if they were watertight, they weren't watertight enough against the pressure. And so even once the ship hit the mine and once what hatches could be sealed were sealed, water still got past them, and this caused the rising flooding, which eventually doomed the ship, which is almost, if you shave off the serial numbers, a carbon copy of why Nevada ended up beached and in a sinking condition after taking damage that in and of itself should not have sunk her. So it's a kind of a 50, not quite a 50-50. Despite her, relatively speaking, compared to later ships' lack of underwater protection, Audacious should have survived hitting that mine. But a small degree of faulty design and a lot of faulty damage control and unauthorized work on her after the fact meant that no matter what they did, once that mine was hit, the ship was pretty much going down, because they weren't locked up. And up next, at the start of the Dreadnought race, and I suppose in early World War I or World War II, how possible would it have been to crash build big gun ships by cannibalising older ships? For example, could the Royal Navy have built a hull with engineering, etc., and then take the turrets, secondary battery and anti-aircraft guns from, say, an R-class to speed things up? Well, that's basically how you get HMS Vanguard, although those guns were in storage. But future Vanguard successors, which the Royal Navy did have penciled in if, obviously, war hadn't broken out in 1939, would have done pretty much exactly that. Not the secondaries, because casement guns are really obsolete by World War II, but the main guns and their turrets, and possibly some of the anti-aircraft weapons as well, would have been taken from old R-class as they were decommissioned in order to speed up the construction of, Vanguard version 2.0, version 3.0, version 4.0 as the years went on. Now, where it's possible to do that, of the three scenarios you presented, yes, World War II, obviously, Vanguard, that could be done, because the 15-inch 42, once refurbished, was still a relatively decent battleship-grade weapon. At the start of the Dreadnought race, yes, to a certain degree, if you started pulling pre-Dreadnoughts out of line. I mean, they did take turrets from Lord Nelson and Agamemnon to help complete Dreadnought. The problem there, however, is that actually naval gun technology, although it's all 12-inch, had advanced quite a fair bit. So you'd either be robbing out the more modern 12-inch 45 guns from the Lord Nelsons again, in order to facilitate the construction of another Dreadnought. And obviously you have the problem there that each of the pre-Dreadnoughts is only assigned 2 turrets, and if you're building a Dreadnought, you need 5 turrets if you're building a Dreadnought, Bellerophon or St. Vincent. So you'd have to be stripping out 2.5, basically 3 ships to get the guns for just the one. And if you dial back to maybe the formidable London Duncan or King Edward VII, they have 12-inch 40s, and they're still useful ships, those classes, at the start of the Dreadnought race. So really you haven't going to maybe go back to the Majestics and Canopuses, especially the Majestics. Maybe the Canopuses, even in 1906, the Canopuses are on the edge of being viable, but they're still useful. But the problem is those are 12-inch 35s, so none of those are really viable full-on Dreadnought scale weapons. So, yeah, basically, you might have been completed a Dreadnought sister ship by taking even more of the weaponry assigned for Lord Nelson and Agamemnon, but it would be marginal. The older stuff is just not really viable. At the start of World War I, you basically have a similar problem in that in 1914, any and all Dreadnoughts you can't cannibalise. You maybe have a better argument for cannibalising some of the mid-level Royal Navy pre-treads, but they're still stuck with 12-inch 40 caliber guns, and your latest and greatest ships are 15-inch armed, and even the ones before them are 13.5, so they're not really going to be all big gun designs at that point. So yeah, it's marginally possible to build an extra ship at the start of the Dreadnought race by stealing the entirety of the production and backdated production for the Lord Nelsons. It's not really possible in World War One because the only ships you could steal from their guns are hopelessly obsolete compared to 15-inch guns, which are the latest battleship weapons. And actually, therefore, in World War II, thanks to the interwar treaties, it's actually the most viable, where, yeah, robbing out R-class for main battery turrets would be possible if you had the other industry to build things, to build the ships. And this is one of the problems with a Vanguard, is that there is thanks to the interwar rundown on British shipbuilding industry, there is a fixed limit to how many ships the British can actually build when it comes to capital ships, both in terms of production of large-scale geared turbine power plants, the geared turbines themselves, particularly the reduction gears, and armour plate. The Royal Navy estimating that, they could build 2 capital ships a year. They'd invested a lot of money so they could build 3, in terms of armour plate output, plus all the other armour plate they had to produce. But, they're not really going to be able to produce all that much more. Now, you could make an argument perhaps they could have completed the Lion and Temeraire, as either proto-vanguards, or perhaps just gone, decommission. Well, you'd have to decommission 3 R-class and quickly try and reconfigure the 16-inch guns to accept 15-inch, which would have been theoretically possible, and then launch them as basically 9 15-inch gun ships. In theory possible, but by the time that you would have been starting to consider that, they were already, way overdue anyway, and they really did want the 16-inch if they could get them. But, that's a road not travelled. Maybe if Lion and Temeraire had been commissioned as half-sisters of Vanguard with old R-class 15-inch guns, that might have been a thing for World War II. Ryan Frederick asks, much is made in both directions about Churchill's time as First Lord of the Admiralty. Who would you pick as some of the top performers in this job over its 336-year history? Now, the details of who does what as First Lord of the Admiralty is something that's one of the weaker areas of my research, because being more the political appointee side of things, as opposed to the First Sea Lord, who is obviously a naval officer, I tend to not encounter the First Lord of the Admiralty in my research all that much, unless they're doing something exceptionally stupid, which then obviously wouldn't qualify them as a top performer, or if they're being particularly good at ridding the Royal Navy of the corruption that perennially shows up. So the Earl of Sandwich, at various points in his career, actually he's First Lord of the Admiralty a couple of times, tends to get a fairly good press. And then, of course, you have various admirals, Anson, Howe, Keppel, St. Vincent, etc., who make the transition over into public life as MPs, and that therefore allows them to be appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, even though they are also, serving or ex-naval officers. So most of them, Anson particularly, and Howe as well, tend to get a fair amount of credit for reforming the Navy. So they do particularly good jobs. But to be honest, it's not one of the stronger areas of research that I've done. And outside of those names, Oliver Sandwich obviously not being an admiral, the others all being admirals, I don't tend to run into them all that much, other than obviously Churchill, because most of the time they just tend to stay in the background, at least for the bits of naval history that I'm interested in researching, unless they do something incredibly stupid. Argle Bargle IV asks, my father served on the USS Arcturus during World War II. It's described as an attack cargo ship, which really sounds like an oxymoron. Just what type of ship was it, and what sort of armament did it have that would qualify it with the adjective attack? So, the attack cargo ships, this is Arcturus herself, by the way, were, in some ways you could say, the ancestors of the LHDs and LPDs of today. More the LPDs than the LHDs, because obviously you see they don't have any kind of flight facilities. But essentially you had various troop and vehicle carrying landing craft, some of which were big enough to sail around on their own, but others couldn't sail across the oceans on their own. They had to be transported by various ships. And when they were looking at how to do this, they realised, well, we have a bunch of cargo ships that already have king posts and so forth installed for some fairly major cranes, so we can install even more cranes so that they can handle pretty hefty landing craft, and therefore they become landing craft transports. But if you're going to use a cargo ship, it obviously has a very deep hold as well, so you're not going to be able to store landing craft in the hold, but you can store military cargo in the hold that the troops in the landing craft are going to need, and the cranes can also help you offload that. So the idea is that these ships can sail in to a landing, they'll then offload troops and supplies that are on deck and in the landing craft into the water. Those troops can go ashore, the boats can come back, and then they can be filled with more readily accessible stores and additional men and so forth. And then once the troops have seized some kind of harbour, or indeed with a mulberry or something, you've built your own harbour, well then their in-depth supplies, more ammo, more food, heavier equipment, etc., are all there on the ship already, so it just has to move over to the dock and unload, and hey, you've got extra stuff for your men to take with them on the offensive. So that all seems to work out, assuming the thing doesn't get sunk. And in order to avoid it being sunk, well, you can't fit it with depth charge launchers and sonar and stuff. But what you can do is select some of your slightly faster cargo ships for this conversion, or indeed build them slightly faster than average. Bearing in mind, sort of 8 to 12 knots is the average of a cargo ship at this period, so anything above 15 is relatively decent. But then someone said, well, okay, we can't defend them against subs, but if aircraft come along, then, well, they need to be able to defend themselves to a degree, so they began to acquire 20mm and or 40mm AA guns. And then, I presume, in case a surface submarine or something like that came along, most of them had some kind of 4 or 5 inch gun stuck on as well. I mean, a single 5 inch isn't going to be all that much good as an AA system, but it would be relatively good for point defense against smaller threats. And of course, it also meant that you could get a basic level of shore bombardment for what it was worth out of the attack cargo ships. You would generally, though, want to use them in the preliminary general bombardment. They're not going to have the detailed fire control systems to be able to provide active close support bombardment. And because, they're relatively large ships, they have armament, they have troops, they have lots of supplies, and they're going to be near the front lines of any amphibious landing. You also give them extensive radio communication suites and so on and so forth, so that they can coordinate what they're doing with everybody else and internally. And so they're designated attack cargo ships because they are on the front line of any amphibious landing, as opposed to other cargo ships that wouldn't be involved in the amphibious landing until afterwards, when the ports are secured, and then they'd come in under the cover of everything else. So, yeah, that's the origin of the attack cargo ship, and that's what Arcturus did. In fact, Arcturus was present at multiple important Allied landings, so it would have been a fairly interesting and entertaining time to be aboard that ship. Richard Scrabble asks, British capital ships during peacetime in the modern era appear to have the last foot or so of their main gun barrels polished. Is this a case of my gun is prettier than your gun, or is there a technical explanation? So I assume you mean the modern era of the Channel. So here you see Queen Elizabeth's forward guns. Now, this isn't actually the guns themselves. If you see pictures of those same guns in wartime, you'll notice that pretty much like everybody else's, they just look like painted tubes of metal. What these shiny parts are actually the tampions, which are the things that block up the end of the gun to stop water and such getting into them while the ship's in transit during peacetime. So in some cases, depending on a ship-by-ship basis, tampions could just be literally plugs that sat in the gun, but especially on larger ships, they tended to be more like caps that sat over the gun with a crest in the middle, and those caps tended to be made of metal, which would then be polished to a high sheen, and then because they obviously fit relatively closely to the guns and the guns are very large, it gives the appearance that the end of the barrel of each of the guns is really, really highly polished, when 99% of cases it wasn't. Some much older guns in the late 19th century were, but that's a different matter compared to a World War I, World War II period. Kra F1 asks, though a tactical success, was the Indian Ocean raid by Japan in early 1942 a strategic error? Would it have been more advantageous to strike east against the US or Australia instead and move up the operational timelines of the Port Moresby and Solomon Island attacks? Or was this necessary to push back the threat that the Royal Navy posed? Theoretically, yes, but it would depend on getting the Japanese Army's cooperation to get the transports ready in order to facilitate the offensive. Because remember, the Japanese Navy does have some landing capability, but doesn't have anything like the same levels of landing capability the Japanese Army does, and most of their capability for invasion comes from escorting Japanese Army transports into the area. But assuming that they could arrange that, then in theory, yes, it would have been a much better option for them to go for advancing into the New Guinea, Australian, Solomon Island waters areas, because they had put the Allies quite significantly on the back foot. And I think this was the thing. They anticipated that the US would be on the back foot for a while. But that's all with hindsight. At the time, when the Japanese are looking at it, they think the Americans are going to be out of action for a little bit longer than historically they actually are. And they do need to try and eliminate the Royal Navy threat. They think they can pull off a second Pearl Harbor. They don't, thanks to the fact that British intel is actually pretty good at decoding Japanese transmissions and working out what's going on. But the British had put a reasonably sized force in the form of Force A and Force B into the Indian Ocean. It wasn't as big as they wanted it to be, but the Japanese knew what the British did want to put in there, and they didn't know that, obviously, necessarily the British weren't going to be able to put all of that there. And given that their next stage of major offensives was a plan to attack into Port Moresby, the Solomon Islands, etc., the last thing they wanted at that point was a significant British presence gradually building up in the Indian Ocean, basically being a knife held at their backs, whilst they had to fight their way through what they thought would be what was left of the US Navy. And so eliminating the Royal Navy's presence in the Indian Ocean was a fairly important thing that they had to go for. And to an extent, you can see the logic. Obviously, historically, we know that eventually those carriers and battleships would have to be called back to fight in the Mediterranean, but the Japanese don't know that at the time. And if you think about, if you're fighting the Battle of the Coral Sea, for example, it's not that far away from Australia. Australia's part of the British Commonwealth at the time, or Empire, depending on how you want to look at it. And if you know, which they did, that Somerville has 2 modern fleet carriers plus Hermes in the Indian Ocean, if you are going to launch a major offensive that's going to result in a fight like Coral Sea, the absolute last thing you want is to be fighting the US Navy in one direction and then have the Royal Navy come sneaking up from the other direction and catch you in a pincer. Or vice versa, you head out into the Coral Sea, maybe you run into the Royal Navy coming to defend Australia, and then while you're fighting them, then the US Navy turns up from behind. It puts Japan in a bad situation. So if you think the US Navy's on the back foot and you have some spare time, then yeah, sure, try and knock out the Royal Navy presence. Of course, it doesn't quite work out for them. It very nearly goes horrifically wrong for them, albeit that the outcome of what could have happened if Somerville had engaged Nagumo is something that no amount of wargaming can ever fully predict. I've gone through all the records at the National Archives from the British side of things, and yeah, all that come up with no matter how many simulations you run, is it's an incredibly open-ended scenario, which could result in anything from the loss of a good chunk of the Kido Butai to surface gunfire, all the way through to the loss of Warspite, 2 modern fleet carriers and all their escorts, 2 Japanese airstrikes, and everything in between. All with vaguely equal levels of plausibility, of course, depending on how much you weight certain factors that were occurring at the time. So the disadvantage, I think, for the Japanese was that, it did put a bit of a pause on their eastwards operations, but more importantly, it also, although they didn't lose too many aircraft compared to what the British lost overall, they did lose about 2 squadrons worth of highly trained naval aviators, in terms of both killed and wounded. And that might not seem like a lot, but bearing in mind that the Indian Ocean raid happens at the beginning of April 1942, and within the next couple of months they've got to fight Coral Sea and Midway. A couple of extra squadrons worth of experienced naval aviators could have been really, really useful on some of the Japanese carriers in the forthcoming months, and obviously also sailing around and doing all that operation in the Indian Ocean put wear and tear on some of their ships, which meant they had to get repaired, so not all of them would be available for things like Coral Sea. So overall, the logic behind Operation Sea at the start of it was actually sound, but it ended up, even though it didn't cost the Japanese that much, what it did cost them compared to what they gained was actually probably a net negative result, which probably had a minor influence on the forthcoming battles of Coral Sea and Midway in terms of non-available pilots and non-available ships. Dominic von Bismarck asks, in the Age of Sail, it seems to be a lot harder for nations' navies to hit above their weight class, especially when the larger navy stops playing games. How would a smaller navy threaten a larger one enough to be taken seriously in an engagement during this time? Yeah, this statement is basically true because unlike in the latter stages of the 19th century and then into the 20th century, there is no asymmetric weapon, really. There's no torpedo or mine equivalent where a much smaller ship can deliver firepower sufficient to damage or destroy a much larger ship. About the closest you can get is a Fireship, and by the time of the classic Age of Sail, i.e. the 18th century, even those are to a certain extent a known quantity, and they're much, much, much more useful in mass fleet engagements, which as a small navy you can't do, or in attacks on enemy ports, which again, as a small navy, you're usually not going to do. Out in the open seas, a Fireship is really, really not that useful. Now, when it comes to how you manage to get a larger navy to back off, the first thing to do is either find allies or pick your confrontation time for a period when that larger navy is fighting someone else who's also larger than you. So basically distract your opponent navy with a larger target so that they have to devote most of their strength against that. And then secondly, and this is something that actually holds true not just for the Age of Sail, but for pretty much, at least in my opinion, for all smaller navies, don't bother trying to just build large numbers of small craft or larger numbers of even smaller craft in the hope of mobbing your opponent, because your opponent can just outbuild you and still have all the big stuff as well. The best approach for a smaller navy, I think, is to build a smaller number, because you're only going to build small numbers anyway, of large, powerful craft that are the most capable for their type. Because if you get your opponent to underestimate you or distract them such that they can't come after you full force, even if they do properly estimate your strength, then all they can send against you is their smaller vessels. And if they do that, and you have equivalent vessels of that type, but they're bigger and better, you will be able to put pressure on the enemy and hopefully win some engagements, which might make the enemy back off, or at least buy you some time before, they show up full force. And that's pretty much what the US Navy did. I mean, for all the fact that Congress kept trying to strangle the US Navy in its crib for the first 100 years or so of its existence, building the super frigates was pretty much a spot-on mark of perfect genius when it came to how to be a smaller navy in the Age of Sail, because they realised that Congress wasn't going to let them build any ships of the line, although after the War of 1812 they did. But before then, they weren't going to get any ships of the line. There was no point building 28-gun, 32-gun frigates, because no matter how good you made them, something like the Royal Navy could turn up with, other 32 to 28-gun frigates that were just as good, or they could turn up with 36 or 38-gun frigates that were also good but also outgunned you, and they could turn up in much larger numbers than you. So the solution is, build what's effectively a fourth-rate frigate and be able to overwhelm the vast, vast majority of enemy frigates that might come after you, with the exception of one or two. That's how you get someone to take you seriously. And of course, unfortunately, the enemy taking you seriously might involve them then showing up with a bunch of heavy razes converted from third rates and a bunch of actual ships of the line, which is what the Royal Navy did in 1814. But hey, at least you've got them to take you seriously. In a straight-up fight, well, you basically pick your moment. If you're going to have a straight-up fight with a larger navy in the Age of Sail and you can't get an allied fleet to swoop in and save the day, you either try and confront a small squadron of them on the high seas with a much larger or equal-sized squadron of your individually superior ships, or you do what the Dutch did and turtle up in harbour with the backup of floating batteries and shore batteries to multiply your firepower and hope that the enemy comes to you, where, you have a certain degree of an advantage. And it very nearly did work for the Dutch at Copenhagen. It was just a pity that they were facing off against Nelson, who didn't really care the fact that he was losing for most of that battle. So yeah, those are really the only ways to get a small navy to take a large navy to take a small navy seriously in the age of sail, outside of just flat out, recruiting somebody to distract or destroy the vast majority of your opponent's fleet. And Kevin Webber asks, please discuss fireships. I assume tides and weather had to be right. Did they also pack them with powder? Did sailors steer them for a while, then depart at the last minute? And in what engagements, if any, did they play a crucial role? So yes, tides and weather were a hugely important factor. Fireships tended to be the most successful when they were used in ports, against ships that couldn't move much, if at all. And at that point, the tide and the weather to help carry the ship towards its intended target was hugely important. Generally, the ships would be packed with all sorts of combustibles, hatches would be open to allow the drafts of air. They would not pack them with powder. In fact, usually if the ship had any powder in it, it would be removed, except for the guns, which would be loaded so that they would fire off either when the ship was alongside a target or on its way in, for added morale effect and or to distract the opponents. And sailors, they would steer them in, so because a fire ship is completely unguided, and unlike a steamship, it doesn't even have necessarily a guaranteed course, because if the wind shifts, it can just take the fire ship with it. So crews of fire ships tended to attract some hazard pay, because they had to take the ships in remarkably close, make sure they set the fires early enough so that the ship would be fully ablaze by the time it reached its target, but also late enough that perhaps the enemy wouldn't realise what's going on, because, a fire ship, once it's on fire, makes a fairly obvious signpost for what's going on. So you want to try and sneak in as close as possible. And then once you've done all that, you then have to get out, which, if it's an ad hoc fire ship, something that's just put together out of an old vessel nearby, which, to be fair, characterises most fire ship attacks, that can be a very interesting experience. Purpose-built fireships, which did exist, actually had all sorts of fun little improvements, such as bigger hatchways, doors or hatches built into the sterns specifically for a rapid exit. And one of the other ways you can tell a fireship from a regular built warship is that the gun ports opened downwards. And the idea of this was that if the fireship was then utilised in its intended role, as it went in and the ropes burned away on the gun ports, the gun port doors would continue to be down and open, rather than the conventional top-hinged ones, which, of course, if the ropes burned through, would close the gun port unless the gun was stuck far enough out. And these purpose-built fireships had a bit of a weird career, in that they tended, even at the time when they existed, not to be used as much as the ad hoc ones, in part because they'd gone through such the expense and time and effort to build a purpose-built fireship that otherwise looked very much like a regular warship. They ended up often being used as regular warships because they were quite expensive to expend. Whereas if you had an old battered ship nearby that no one was going to miss in a few months, that was actually a cheaper alternative than the purpose-built vessel. Nevertheless, some purpose-built fireships were expended. The big heyday of the fireship at sea, as opposed to attacking things in port, was during the Anglo-Dutch Wars. But at the same time, the main intended use of the fireships in big fleet battles to drive into clumps of enemy ships and set them on fire corresponded with the fact that both the Dutch and the English fleets were entirely cognizant of what a threat these things could be, and had developed quite a few tactics to deal with them. So they didn't actually accomplish all that much with fireships. Even the last major use of fireships was mostly against beached targets, just to make sure that they were definitely dead. And then you have small harbour uses like fire rafts and things like that. But in terms of the major engagements where they played crucial roles, obviously the Spanish Armada is one. Although they didn't set anything on fire, they did scare the Spanish fleet out of harbour in a disorganised manner. The Dutch used some on the Medway to set fire to a bunch of Royal Navy vessels, and there were various other uses of fireships later on, but those are the two sort of really big battles that tipped the entire courses of a war. But there were lots of smaller engagements where fireships could be fairly decisive on an individual basis, where you're talking about small squadron actions and such, because it's much easier in those kind of environments for that to happen. Of course, technically speaking, in terms of a sacrificial ship designed to destroy itself and take a chunk of the enemy with it, you could also then look at things like the use of C1 and C3 during the raid on Zeebrugge in World War One, and the use of HMS Campbelltown against the St. Nazaire Drydock in World War Two as kind of modern-ish fire ships, except without the continued setting on fire. They just went boom. And that's all for this week. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And, well, if you're listening to this during the weekend of release, that probably means that I'm at Tankfest. So hopefully, while some of you are at home listening to this, I'll be saying hello to others of you down at Tankfest in Bovington in Dorset. And if I have met any of you there, then fantastic, great. Also, if you do happen to be in the Weymouth-Bovington area, please do make sure to visit Books Afloat. Check what time they're open, but one of the best bookshops for random naval history books that I've ever come across, and I'll certainly be patronising the place. Is it patronising? I don't know. Whichever one is the non-negative one. Anyway, I'll be down there spending money on books, and I will be bringing a sack barrow to help me carry them all away. And, well, I think that's it for this Drydock. Next week is, of course, the Patreon Drydock, so buckle in for that one. The two-parter version that I did last time for episode 200 seems to have struck a balance that most people appreciate, so I'll try and keep going with that one. And see you again in another video.